Corporate America is on a race to the bottom, trying to figure out how low quality they can make their products until people stop buying. And when you look at products nowadays, it's clear. They haven't figured out the answer yet because the quality of stuff just won't stop getting worse. Solid wood furniture built for a lifetime has devolved to cheap particle board that is unable to survive a move. Clothes made from sturdy fabrics that would last years have devolved to cheap polyester that barely lasts a season. And appliances that used to run strong for 20 years have devolved to be unfixable in nearly half the time. Just when you thought that products couldn't get worse, corporate America steps in and says,
"Nah, yo, hold my poodle. Hold my poodle. Hey, yo, what's up? Y'all got a problem?"
Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear we are now living in the era of cheap. Everything is garbage nowadays, and the question is, how did we get here? Because it wasn't always this way. Well, the truth is, like most things in this world, this wasn't caused by one single event, but it is a long, complex story that was shaped by corporate interests, consumer manipulation, corporate profits, political policy, and market control. And in this video, I want to tell you that story because the decline of quality wasn't random, but it was engineered step by step over a century. And the first blueprint appeared about 100 years ago. And so let's start there with Chapter 1, Planned Obsolescence. Now, let me start this off by saying that this video is not about planned obsolescence, but it's just a small part of our story that begins in the early 1900s with the light bulb. In the early 1900s, light bulbs were an engineering miracle. I mean, they were made so well that they would never stop working. In fact, to this day, there is one light bulb in a fire station in California that has been glowing for over 120 years. However, nowadays, light bulbs don't last that long, which doesn't make any sense because you'd think that the technology would only get better. Well, in the 1920s, these light bulbs that last forever posed a big problem for companies. Because when people had products that lasted forever, there was no need to buy it again, which meant that companies wouldn't make any more money. And you can't run a profitable business that way. And so in 1924, the world's biggest light bulb manufacturers met in secret in Geneva and formed what was known as the Phoebus Cartel. Their mission was to collectively lower the lifespan of their light bulbs to 1,000 hours, so people would need to buy more light bulbs and they could make more money. They created this concept that many companies would use later that was called planned obsolescence, which is deliberately designing products with shorter lifespans so people have to buy more. And this is the start of products getting worse that would be used in other industries, like Apple, famously sending updates to their older phones to lower the lifespan of their batteries. Epson printers sending software updates to destroy the printer when using third-party ink. And washing machine companies sealing their tanks so it cannot be repaired. Planned obsolescence was the first blueprint to making products worse, but at the same time, there was another form of obsolescence being created, but this was a little bit different. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 2, Perceived Obsolescence. Now, not every industry could get away with making their products worse. Cars, for example, couldn't be made to just last a few years and then fall apart because it could pose serious safety risks and people wouldn't accept that. Well, that's actually not true. The Ford Pinto was exploding for years and nobody did anything about it. But back in the early 1900s, the design of cars rarely changed. The famous Ford Model T, that was designed to be affordable and mass-produced, changed very little over 20 years. The few changes were mechanical, not cosmetic. However, just like the light bulb, this posed a big problem because if people had a car that just kept working, there was no need to go out and buy the same one again, and that impacted companies' bottom line. But in 1924, a new idea emerged in the auto industry that would solve this problem, and it was created by a man named Alfred P. Salone, who was the CEO of General Motors. His idea was instead of selling cars for durability and practicality, he would start selling cars as fashion statements. And to do that, he came up with a clever idea, and it was called yearly model updates, where every year they would take the same car and make some slight changes to it, like color changes, update technology features, and minor style changes, and then rebrand it as new. The mechanics of the car wouldn't change that much, but the car would just get this facelift, and this would impact consumer behavior in two ways. First, it created the illusion of progress. Even if the car underneath was basically the same, it looked newer, better, and more modern. Second, it made last year's model look old and outdated. And this concept is called perceived obsolescence, which is when products are designed or marketed in a way that makes them feel outdated or unfashionable. And this idea revolutionized the auto industry, where even nowadays, every year, we see car companies release slightly new models that keep people upgrading their cars every few years. And this idea of perceived obsolescence was so successful that it spread to other industries. Fashion cycles convinced us last season's clothes were outdated. Apple turned yearly iPhone launches into cultural events, and home decor shifted with the trends and the catalogs. Perceived obsolescence didn't break your products, but it made you see your products as old and outdated, as disposable. However, these first two concepts were very mild compared to what would happen in the 70s, when corporations would completely change how they operated. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 3, Shareholder Capitalism. Until the late 70s, the majority of corporations operated under a model called stakeholder capitalism, which is the idea that a company's responsibility was a balance between its shareholders, employees, customers, and communities it operated in. Companies were expected to balance profit with long-term stability and social responsibility. And it wasn't perfect, but it created an environment where employees were treated well, products were designed well, and in the long term, companies made money. However, by 1970, a famous economist challenged this idea, and his name was Milton Friedman, who famously wrote an essay in the New York Times that argued that businesses' sole responsibility is to increase the profits for its shareholders. And this idea later became known as shareholder capitalism. And under this model, the customer wasn't the priority anymore. Neither were the workers, communities, or long-term reputation. The priority was quarterly earnings, short-term stock prices, and maximizing returns for investors. And this idea really started to explode in the 1980s, and the first man to put this idea in practice was named Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric, and whose motto was fix it, close it, or sell it. Jack was an aggressive CEO. Any division of General Electric that wasn't number one or number two in its industry was either restructured, shut down, or sold off. And when it came to his own employees, he focused on a ruthless strategy called rank and yank, where he would categorize employees into top, average, and lowest performers. And every year, he would fire the bottom 10% performers, which created this company culture of constant fear and internal competition, and he oversaw massive layoffs, closings of factories, and outsourcing jobs overseas. And these practices earned him the nickname Neuron Jack, where like a neuron bomb, he eliminated the people while leaving the building standing. I mean, in his first 5 years, he laid off 112,000 people in his company. And over time, General Electric became less of a company that sells products and invests in research, quality, and workers, but more of a financial company focused on increasing stock price, stock buybacks, and giving dividends to please its shareholders. And corporate America loved him. In 1999, Fortune magazine dubbed him the manager of the century. And once Welch showed people how profitable this could be, it became the model for corporate America. Don't build things that last, but just maximize short-term returns. However, eventually, this short-term obsession caught up with General Electric, where the stock price collapsed twice. The company nearly collapsed in the 2008 financial crisis and received a $139 billion government bailout, and eventually was split into 3 companies. And the greatest irony of this story is in a 2009 interview, Jack Welch called shareholder capitalism the dumbest idea in the world. And while CEOs like Welch were reshaping corporate America around short-term gains and decreasing qualities, the government was beginning to change the rules of the game, which leads me to Chapter 4, Deregulation. For decades, strict regulations kept industries in check. Antitrust enforcement limited how big a company could get, and regulations ensured some level of stability and service quality. However, by the 1980s, that all began to change due to a changing America and the man that led it, Ronald Reagan, whose philosophy was government should get out of the way of business and focused on cutting taxes, shrinking government, and deregulation. And one of the first examples of deregulation changing industries was with airlines for decades. Air travel was controlled by the Civil Aeronautics Board that set prices, controlled routes, and ensured stability. And in this era, airlines couldn't compete on price, so they had to compete on comfort and quality. However, in 1978, a major shift happened under the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, signed under Carter but fully implemented under Reagan, that took away these regulations. And in many ways, this deregulation was good because free market competition made ticket prices lower, more routes appeared, and more budget options for flying appeared. However, at the same time, there were some cons that came from this, because before, when the government regulated things, the competing metric was quality. However, when regulations were taken away, the competing metric became price. And I don't need to tell you, but nowadays air travel is a very uncomfortable experience. There's no legroom, fees are nickel and diming everyone, and this service is often terrible. It was a race to the bottom because price became the competing metric, and also because of this, many small airlines couldn't compete and failed. The remainder merged into the giants that we know today. And as deregulation would spread to other industries, there was a new thought process that would shape American business. We went from the old philosophy of big is bad and the government should break up monopolies to the new philosophy of big is fine as long as prices stay low. And over time, we would see more and more companies merge together, and the main competing metrics stopped being quality and started being price. Meaning that everything was getting cheaper, but at the same time, everything was getting a whole lot crappier. And one company that would send this idea into overdrive was America's largest retailer, Walmart, who was not only shaping where consumers shopped, but was also shaping what they bought, how those products were made, and even how entire industries operated. And that's the story of Chapter 5, The Walmart Effect. By 1990, Walmart had become America's largest retailer, and a huge reason for that was because of their motto, always low prices. They won over customers by being cheaper than anybody else. However, that strategy didn't just happen, but somebody had to pay for those low prices, and that created a strategy that completely changed retail. You see, as Walmart grew, its scale became unmatched. And that scale gave Walmart an enormous bargaining power, where they could literally just walk into negotiations with suppliers and just tell them what to do. And the biggest example of this is with the brand Rubbermaid. In the 80s, Rubbermaid was known for quality plastic products and was even recognized by Forbes as one of the most desired companies. However, by 1990, something big happened that impacted Rubbermaid. The price of resin, which is used to create plastic, skyrocketed as much as 60%, and Rubbermaid's biggest retail sales came from Walmart. And when Rubbermaid approached Walmart and spoke about raising prices to cover the cost, Walmart declined and cut their shelf space for cheaper alternatives. And at that time, a huge portion of their sales came from Walmart. And when they lost the Walmart shelving space, they lost a massive portion of their sales, eventually leading them to bankruptcy in 1999. And once they went bankrupt, they got acquired by Newell that conformed to Walmart and shipped production overseas, lowered their quality, and Rubbermaid became another cheap plastic brand on Walmart shelves. Walmart had such a large market power that it could just essentially tell companies what to do. And along with Rubbermaid, in order to keep prices low at Walmart, Walmart forced other high-quality brands like Levi's, Black & Decker, Huffy, and Fruit of the Looms to lower their prices by shifting production overseas and lowering quality. And as I said before, when price becomes the competing metric, quality is the first thing to go. And this market dominance later became known as the Walmart effect, where Walmart demands lower prices, brands cut quality and outsource to meet those demands, the brand's reputation erodes and mid-tier disappears, and consumers get used to cheap goods, reinforcing the cycle. The Walmart effect didn't just change individual brands, but it changed the entire supply chain. Their motto, always low prices, was really just a demand, and so companies had no choice but to look overseas for cheap labor and cheap production costs. And as this was happening, US trade policy was opening the door for cheap products to flood the American market, which leads me to Chapter 6, Globalization. By the 1990s, the world was becoming a lot more connected, and with Walmart setting the standard for cheap, low-quality goods, globalization was the force that would deliver it. And by the mid to late 90s, there would be a series of policies that would flood the American marketplace with cheap, low-quality goods. The first policy was NAFTA, which opened free trade in North American countries, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, which ended up moving many companies' factories south of the border for lower-paid workers and lower-quality goods. And of course, there were some consequences at home. Factories closed in the United States and became ghost towns, and millions of jobs were lost. But NAFTA was only the beginning, because just a few years later, globalization would go into overdrive when China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, which opened the door for an even bigger flood of cheap imports, not just from across the border, but from across the ocean. Factories moved to China to take advantage of ultra-low wages and looser regulations, and American store shelves were suddenly filled with cheap products made in China. And once again, those savings came at a cost. Quality continued to decline and entire American industries were hollowed out. And then another event happened when the multi-fiber arrangement that placed limits on how much clothing and textiles developing countries could export to developed countries was phased out in 2005. And the American textile industry collapsed, mills shut down, and almost 1 million jobs were gone, while fast fashion market exploded. And with all of these events, everything was getting cheaper, but the quality was also getting ridiculously low. Solid wood furniture devolved to cheap particle board, cotton, wool, and denim clothing devolved to cheap polyester, and appliances that would last 20 years are now unfixable. Welcome to the era of cheap shit, and like all of my recent videos, I want to finish this video off with Chapter 7, Where Do We Go From Here? As I said in the beginning of this video, everything is getting worse, not because of one single event, but because of many. As we've discussed, we've seen it evolve from planned obsolescence to perceived obsolescence, to shareholder capitalism, to deregulation, to the Walmart effect, to finally globalization. And look, I am no economist or historian, but I am just a YouTuber who went down a rabbit hole, did some research, connected the dots, and now I'm presenting what I learned to you. And so I want to finish this video off telling you 3 takeaways that I personally learned from making this video. 1. Policy shapes products, not consumers. When I first started making this video, I thought that I was going to dedicate a chapter to consumer behavior as a driving force. But the more I researched this video, the more I understood that consumers really had nothing to do with this, but the decline of quality was shaped by business strategies, consumer training, regulation, deregulation, and political policy. We consumers didn't just wake up one day and start demanding cheap disposable junk, but it was these grand forces that ultimately created the demand. 2. Once Pandora's box is opened, it can't be closed. The story of cheap goods is really just the story of Pandora's box. We allowed cheap goods to flood the market, consumers got used to it, and there is no going back. Unfortunately, I think that there is no going back. Once you start giving consumers the option to buy a $5 shirt, they're not suddenly just going to buy $50 shirts. I'm sure there are solutions, but I don't think that the old ways will ever happen again. And finally, someone somewhere is paying the ultimate price. The big message of this video was something that I repeated a few times. When price becomes the competing metric, quality is the first thing to go. But the truth is, lower quality isn't the only consequence, but with this system, someone somewhere is paying the ultimate price for these cheaper goods. Whether that's hollowed out towns in America, erosion of industries, child labor, unfair conditions, unethical practices, or struggling businesses. And one thing that this video inspired me to do is not use price as my determining metric as a consumer and always go after the cheapest stuff, but also focus on things like durability, where it's made, and the values of the company behind it. I have decided that I am never going to shop at Walmart again. Obviously, I don't have an endless supply of money and still have to be budget conscious. But now that I know how we got here, I want to be more intentional with my money so I don't encourage this race to the bottom. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel for more, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you would love to hear a very interesting story about how the 401k killed the pension, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.